Okay, so now we're going to expand upon what we learned with enumerations. We've only had a basic intro into them, and now we're going to talk about raw and associated values. So this allows us to kind of add additional values to each of the values that we defined in an enumeration. Okay, so we're going to look at first the associated and raw values. Associated will allow us to kind of put in almost parameters with each value in the enumeration, whereas raw values allow us to kind of treat it more like a variable and give it a string value or like an integer value or something like that. Okay, so now we're going to talk about associative and raw values for enumerations. So we saw before that if we create this enumeration, let's use the example of shapes this time. So let's do an enum, we'll do shape. So we saw that we could have, in this case we'll just have a couple of cases. First case is going to be a sphere, second case is going to be rectangular prism. Oh, I'm having trouble typing today. Okay, so in this way we've created this new type which is going to be a sphere, and we've given it a couple of different values. One can be a sphere and one can be a rectangular prism. Okay, so these are values themselves, sphere and rectangular prism, and if we were to create this variable, we could call new shape equals shape dot, and then we could choose either sphere or rectangular prism. Okay, so again, it gives us a limit as to the number of values that this shape could possibly contain. So now let's talk about associated values. Well, this is if we kind of give each of these values a list of values that it can contain. So for example, if we're trying to find dimensions of a sphere, what variables do we use? Well, we only really use the radius ever in sphere, so it might have a double, and it's going to be a double, and it's just going to be one number. Okay, whereas with a rectangular prism, it has three possible dimensions, so it might have double, 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 and in this way, any values associated with it will be the associated values. So for example, a sphere has only one associated value, and that's going to be the double, and usually that's going to be the radius that we find. Whereas a rectangular prism has three associated values, and that's going to be the length, width, and height. Okay, so in this way we could kind of create new variables. So let's just say variable new shape equals shape dot, and let's just go with a rectangular prism, and let's just give it 10, we give it 5.5, and I don't know, 3.3 maybe. Okay, so then it creates this new variable. Oh, well, that's interesting. I didn't know it would do that. But it creates this new variable, which is a rectangular prism, and it gives it 10.0, 5.5, and for our sakes of purposes, 3.3. Okay, and you know what? Let's just change that to 3.4, see if no, it really doesn't. Okay. Okay, so this is one way to kind of assign associated values with a value in an enumeration. And so yeah, that's just one of the things we can do. I think shape's a good example because we could have a bunch of different shapes. So in this case we only had sphere and a rectangular prism. A sphere only has really one dimension, and that's the radius, whereas rectangular prisms have width, height, and length. Okay, so there are going to be three associated values with that. So in this way you can kind of create these new almost, well, they're not, in this case it's a variable, but we're giving it a new type, and then a value, which is going to be a rectangular prism, and then within that value there are these associated values that are width, height, and length. Okay, so next thing we'll talk about is going to be the raw values that something can contain. So let's go ahead and talk about planets. So in fact, planets, that's going to take a little while. Let's talk about, while we were on the topic of hot drinks before, let's talk more about those. So let's have enum, and let's have a t this time. So what values could a t have? Well, it could be it could be a green tea, it could be a herbal tea, could be a black tea, or it could be a white tea. Okay, so this is just what we've seen before. We have a type T, can contain one of these four values. Now, what if we do this? What if we give it the type string? Well, that kind of associates, or that gives each of these what we call a raw value. So then if we were to call, let's say we have a variable t choice, and it's equal to t dot raw value. Well, I guess it should be t dot black t dot raw value. Then we get, just wait for it to run, we should get the string value of whatever this is right now. So there we go, we see the string black tea. And that's because we're taking not just whatever value black tea contains, but we're taking the raw value of it. Okay? And that's because unless we explicitly define these to have different values, so we could say that this is something like, we could say this is something like hello if we want. Well, in this case it doesn't really matter, it's kind of giving us the string values there anyway. Oh right, because that's green tea. If we put it down there, then we could give it the value hello, but that's really not so different from variable assignment. Okay, so unless we give them explicitly give them values, it just takes a string representation of each of these. We could also alternately give this an integer value, and this returns us with 2 because this automatically assigns us to be 0, 1, 2, and 3. Again, we could give these different values. So for example, if I gave this a value of 1, let's see this changes to 3. And that's because it assumes, well, because this is 1, this must be 2, 3, and 4. So, however, if we do this, it kind of defaults a first value to be 0, so 0, 1, 2, 3. Okay? So another thing we can do is we can search for something by its raw value. So let's say variable other t choice is going to be the t dot raw value. I guess it should be t of raw value, and then let's say we want the raw value of 3. And no, there shouldn't be an error. It gives us white tea. And that's because we are searching within t for whatever contains a raw value of 3. And in this case it's going to be white tea because although we haven't assigned it values, because we are saying that they're of type int, this will be the raw value 0, 1, 2, 3. So it searches for 3, finds white tea, and returns that. Okay, so these are some of the things that you can do with raw values with enumerations. If we try to search for something that is non-existent, then it gives us this nil value. Because we only have 4 cases, we cannot have a raw value of 7. Okay, so these are some of the things we can do with raw and associated values. Just to recap what we've learned, we created this new enumeration shape and gave it these associated values for each value. So the first shape is a sphere and only has one double that we're interested in, and that's a radius. Whereas a rectangular prism might have 3 doubles, a width, length, and a height. And these are all associated values, so we can kind of, when we create this new shape, we can call shape dot and then the value we want, and then fill it in with associated values. Okay, and then we created this other enumeration, which was a t, and then we demonstrated getting the raw values. So if we define it to be of type int, for example, unless we explicitly give it values, it implicitly tells us or assigns us to have a raw value of 0, 1, 2, and 3. If this is a string, we saw that it specifically gives the raw values of the string representation of each of these. And let's see if it will do it. I don't think it will. But yeah, that's weird. I'm not sure why. Oh, well, it's probably because of this unfortunate thing here. So if we search for, let's say, white tea, and then it should give us, there we go, so it returns us with white tea. So that just kind of, if we search for the raw value of whatever is assigned to each of these, be it implicitly or explicitly, it returns the value. So we search for the string value that was white t, and because each of these is kind of given a raw string value, it searches for that, finds that this variable white t has this value of white t, so returns that. Okay, so this is associated values, raw values. So I urge you to kind of play around with it a little bit. These are, enumerations are really useful tools for kind of defining this new type. And it just kind of allows you to group together a bunch of values that are going to be similar. So in this case, all these t's, it might be a good idea to keep all your t's together. Whereas shapes, we have sphere and rectangular prism. The previous examples, we saw stuff like hot drinks and weapons and stuff like that. So again, enumeration's really good for kind of keeping together a bunch of values, and also good for assigning these values if you don't want to create variables that are stuff like strings or integers or doubles or whatever. So again, associated values, we can do stuff with the raw values like assigning this variable to contain the raw value, or we can search for stuff by its raw value. Okay, so that's enumerations. This next part we'll be looking at will be classes. So in this part we just expanded upon what we learned with enumerations in the first part. So the first thing we talked about were associated values, and these are a list of like parameters for each of our values in our enumeration. They kind of allow us to include other values associated with each enumeration case. So we saw with a rectangle there were 3 possible doubles, one's a width, one's a length, and one's a height, that go with each rectangle that we create, whereas the sphere only had 1, and that was going to be a radius. Then we talked about raw values, and these basically just allow us to give another value to each case in our enumeration. So we saw that these can be strings or integers, and that allows us to kind of call on things by their raw value, or so we can search for something by its raw value, or we can search for something and retrieve its raw value.